All right, welcome back to our 13th chapter of church history, and we're looking at the church in the 19th century. And so just to do a little bit of a review here, to look at all the things that we've covered, you know, I went over that first part of our church history class several times as a review. So when I'm reviewing this now, what I want to do is just kind of start with 500 years ago and remind you, in the 1500s, 1517 actually was the start of the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther breaks away from the church there over the course of a couple years. We then have lots of other people breaking away from the Catholic Church as well. King Henry VIII in England, John Calvin, and now we know there's 30,000 different denominations of Christianity around the world. But that happens in 1517. At that same time, we talked about how you really start to see, in about that era, you see this explosion in the Catholic Church of people going to the ends of the earth, really, to bring the gospel. And that had already started to happen in bits and pieces. Even remember the first apostles, Thomas is believed to have gone to India, and they scattered. But now what we see is also because of this era of exploration that's also taking place here throughout this time. A lot of the great travelers and explorers of the world who really coming out of Portugal was a main player in kind of exploring the world, and also Spain were probably the top two places that were really sending people out to explore the world. And they also had with them missionaries, because those two countries are very Catholic. And so we see this explosion, and at the same time that the faith is kind of being threatened and divided in Europe because of the Reformation, we see these missionaries going out to the ends of the world, to Africa, to China, to America and South America, right, in our own day as well, or in our own continent. Okay, kind of in the midst of all of that too, we talked about the scientific revolution that takes place as learning and things progress, which again, thanks to the church and its university system that it creates and all these kinds of things, we start to see some explosion in an understanding of science, and technologies also kind of start taking off as well. And we talked about how so many of these central players in the scientific revolution were Catholics themselves, and even priests. Out of the scientific revolution, we then talked last class about the revolutions that start taking place as well. Kind of on the heels there's kind of begins to be new philosophies about how to structure countries, how to structure nations, right? It had always been kind of by rulers, and whether that was a king or a queen, or the Pope even had some many centuries of being in charge of an area. So, but we begin to get these new ideas about how to structure societies. Particularly, we talked last class about the French Revolution, which was a very secular, very non-Christian, kind of coming and attacking and persecuting the church. And then we also have our own American Revolution, which was actually the first major kind of revolution where we talk about America a lot of times as the American experiment. It really is kind of the first opportunity, or the first place where this new way of structuring things is experimented with and tried, which is in the United States. And then the French Revolution actually happens a couple of decades later in the 1790s. But we see this era of revolution starting to take place, which we're going to see continue here in the next chapter. So now we're on to our chapter here, kind of set the stage there. Your book talks about, first and foremost, kind of coming out of the revolutions of America and France, which were, again, very different revolutions in many ways. But we start to see this, even leading into the American and French Revolution, we see this rise of what we call liberalism. Okay, and when we say liberalism, I think it's important to say the church is not talking about, we are not talking about what you typically hear in our own culture right now, and many other countries as well. You hear the breakdown between liberal and conservative, right? And the conservatives typically in any culture now where you're hearing those phrases used, including our own country, right? The conservative, when we hear that, conservative means to preserve. Okay, conservare is Latin for to preserve. So we talk about preserving the things and kind of holding on to the things as they have been typically done in the past, a preference for not changing things unless they absolutely need to be changed and so forth. So a little bit more of a traditional approach to things. That's typically what you mean when you hear the word conservative, whereas with liberal, you usually mean a little bit more progressive, trying new things, trying to think think outside the box. And so both of these, obviously we're not going to talk about, I don't want to get into the distinctions and break down liberal and conservative. But both of these, depending on how they're lived out, can, if you hold too tightly onto the past or things of the past and don't learn from the future and what happens, then conservatism can become problematic. And obviously liberalism, in that sense, in the way that we mean it here, right now, what I'm saying is, the way liberal can become problematic too when it's trying things and leaving behind the past and that which was important and foundational for us, right? Again, when I'm talking about liberalism here, I don't mean the way that we mean it as we've just been talking about. That's not what we mean. Liberalism, in its origin, is a political philosophy, a way to think about the structure of a community and a society. Liberalism has these kind of basic principles, and one of them is the belief that every single person has natural rights that come to them, not because they're rich, not because of anything, not because of where they were born, none of those things other than just the fact that they belong to them by nature as a person. That every single human person has rights because they are a human person. And then, of course, another fundamental principle is that all people, the equality of all people, the fundamental equality of all persons. And then also you see in this liberalism that starts to spring up in the French American Revolution and the stuff preceding that, the belief that all people have the rights to life, liberty, and the ownership of property. Okay, so this new notion, this new political philosophy, which is contradicting or is almost in contrast, really, to the old way of doing things, which was sort of kings, queens, monarchs, kind of a central ruler. This is more this liberalism is this liberal in the sense of freeing, right? This liberalism is this belief that it's kind of the societies are also structured not from the top down, but really from the bottom up. We begin with the basic belief and the foundational belief that all people are equal and have natural rights, and then from there flows how we're going to structure and how we're going to have ruling laws and all that kind of stuff passed. So we kind of see democracy, this idea come out of that, the voting and all those kinds of things that we see in our own country really begins with this political philosophy of liberalism. Now, here's a quick comment about that. That's all great. These things, liberalism is great. We believe as Catholics in the natural rights of all. In fact, we are the ones that it's Catholicism that comes up with and has been saying for 2,000 years that everybody, every person, every human person has rights. Doesn't matter how rich they are, who they are, what class they're in, who their parents are. Every single human person has rights. Every single person, the Church has always taught the fundamental equality of all persons. We're all equal, right, before God, and that we all have rights. The Church has been teaching that. Liberalism is a flowing out of this idea of structuring of a society this way. Liberalism flows out of the Church, out of a Catholic way of thinking about things. No one thought these things before the Catholic Church, before Jesus Christ and the Church. No one was saying that every single person has rights. No one was saying every human person is equal. No one was saying people have the rights to life, liberty, and the ownership of property. So, liberalism is it flows out of Catholicism. Now, here's the problem. It becomes an issue when people stop talking about where these come from, right? When you stop talking about where these issues, where basic natural rights of all people, where the fundamental equality of all persons, where the rights of life, liberty, and the ownership of property, these things come from Christianity. They come from the Catholic Church, the Catholic worldview. But many people today are saying, and people have been doing this for a while now, they've been hijacking liberalism, this belief, and saying we can do this We believe in these things without believing in this Christian idea of who Jesus Christ is, without the church. We don't need the church anymore. We believe in all these things. But here's the problem, is that very quickly people begin to this stuff just falls apart. It's like at the core of the earth, at the core of liberalism is a Christian understanding of who God is, a worldview, a Catholic worldview, and these things flow from it. If you cut off and say, you know what, we're going to have these fruits without the tree from which they come, without the roots of the Catholic Church, without the roots of Jesus Christ, without God, we're just going to have these fruits of liberalism, the fruits die because they're now off the tree from which they come. Right? These grow out of Christianity and Catholicism and Jesus Christ. And so if you try to have them without Catholicism, everything falls apart. And we're seeing that in our own culture, where people today in the United States talk about these things, but they want to do it without God, and it very quickly falls apart. A great example, we'll get to that, we'll get it in just a second. Okay, massive point here too. Really super important, really. Of the 2,000-year history of the church, this is one of those major events. And it wasn't an event, it was over time. But we need to look at the Industrial Revolution, which also takes place in this time span. Okay? Out of the scientific revolution come all of these new technologies. Okay, so as science advances and people make all of these discoveries and science grows, we also get new technologies. The steam engine, better machinery, way to make clothing, and where it had always been a sort of approach to making the clothing by hand and all that kind of stuff. You have these new technologies that allow people to move to larger scales than what had always typically been the way that societies were structured, which was essentially family farms, right? Everybody farmed, everybody mostly grew their own food. Maybe there was a little bit of trade, things like that. It wasn't just all farming, but the vast majority of economies were set up around families living in farms. And so there wasn't also not really the ability to have these major, huge cities. There were some, Rome, and Paris, and London and some of these other places. But even they didn't really have technology that allowed them to be massive, massive cities that they are today, right? So technology allows what begins to happen is the wealth begins to be concentrated in those who own factories and start to have these technologies and harness them. And also then people start moving in, and because of the technology like the sewer system and these other technologies, they also allow people to live in very condensed areas. And so it changes radically the entire makeup of society, of Europe and of America and of all the places that are really affected by this explosion of industry. Okay, lots of consequences in the church. We're going to get to these in a minute. But the consequences of the Industrial Revolution, it starts to break families down. They're no longer living together, or they're definitely not working side by side together anymore like they were on their farms. We also have people very quickly beginning to be treated like machinery, and this is a huge issue. This is a huge, huge issue for the Industrial Revolution. This is the first time where it begins to be about, these people who own these massive factories, and they begin to start to see, and our societies start to see people as pieces of a machinery, right? They stop thinking about them as individual people who I farm with, or who is my neighbor, or who is my family member. And it begins to be this thing where now all of a sudden young children, women, everybody's just thrown in, and they're given really low wages because now all of the wealth is kind of controlled by smaller and smaller groups of people who own the factories and who own the machinery. And so we get people just absolutely, over the course of this explosion in the Industrial Revolution, people just start to get ground down by this machinery of society, and people begin to be thought of as, obviously you see like really wealthy people, and then you see lots and lots of people working in factories and these jobs that have very little wages, and because they really don't have a whole lot of control over it. And so the church is going to respond to this, right? The church is going to respond to this, and I want to talk about that here in just a second. I'm sorry. Actually, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the church's response to the Industrial Revolution in the next chapter, okay? But here we want to talk a little bit about the church, or your textbook moves us to Vatican I, the First Vatican Council. because we also have to talk a little bit about the theology that's going on behind this before we get to the church's response to the Industrial Revolution. Okay. One of the things we also see is as Europe starts to get rid of the church, right? As Europe starts to say, you know what, we can do all of these things, we can do natural rights, we can do all of the stuff that we were doing. As Europe starts to kind of move the church out of its power structure, out of its countries even in some cases, okay, the question arises, you know, what is the Pope's authority? Because the Pope had always kind of been a rule for a long stretch of time there. The Pope was really kind of was one of the leading rulers of a kingdom, right, that stretched all over throughout most of Europe. And so now this question becomes, as that starts to get smaller and smaller, what authority does the Pope have? And the Vatican I, the First Vatican Council in 1869, starts to answer that question. And we get this discussion about papal infallibility, which is really important for you and for us because a lot of people have questions about what is papal infallibility. I remember growing up Catholic, going to Catholic schools, and when I heard papal infallibility, I thought it meant that the Pope could not sin, could not do anything wrong, could never be wrong. And that's not at all what papal infallibility says, which again was hammered out really at Vatican I in 1869. So papal infallibility means in means not, in, and then fallible means error. So to be infallible means to be without error or no error. Okay, so when we say papal infallibility, what we mean by that is that the Pope is without error. Now the question becomes when, right? The Church doesn't say that the Pope is always without error. The Church says, and this is a really important, I just wanted to kind of go through this really quickly. This is from Vatican I in 1869. We teach and define as divinely revealed dogma that when the Roman Pontiff, the Pope, speaks ex cathedra, so that means like from his chair in an authoritative, definitive way, so not like a daily homily, not just the Pope writing a letter or the Pope talking and giving a press conference or anything like that, but when the Pope is really teaching from and puts his foot down and says, from his authority, I am teaching this in a very definitive way, in virtue of his supreme authority, he defines a doctrine concerning faith or morals to be held by the whole Church. He possesses, by the divine assistance that was promised to blessed Peter, so when Jesus says to Peter, I will build this church on you, Peter, and I give you that authority, the Vatican I said that infallibility which the divine Redeemer Jesus wills his church to enjoy in defining doctrine, therefore such definitions of the Pope are of themselves and not by consent of the Church irreformable. So he's saying, the Vatican I is saying when the Pope teaches something definitively and says, I want to invoke my papal infallibility to define this and teach this in a definitive way, and I want to use that authority, then that is not something that the Church needs. The Pope does not need the consent of the Church. The Pope does not need anybody to vote on it. He doesn't need anybody else to weigh in on it. He doesn't need anybody else to approve it. When the Pope does this and says, I want to declare with papal infallibility that this is true and this is something that all Catholics should believe, the Church says that that is not changeable. That is not reformable. So it's locked in. It's set in stone. Now here's the thing. That hasn't been done for about 50 or 60 years. Right? So a lot of people think, well, gosh, why does the Church say that the Pope can't sin or can't commit any error? The popes have done lots of sins through the years, And is that saying that the Pope? No, the Pope goes to confession regularly, right? The Pope would tell you himself, I sin, lots of times, unfortunately. And so, again, papal infallibility is highly misunderstood even by Catholics, and it's really important to know what we do believe about that. Okay? As we wind down this chapter, it's also important to know that these revolutions that we started talking about with France and America first, okay, were the first ones, these other revolutions start to kick off in Europe through the 1800s, essentially affecting the papal territory. So again, as we were saying, the Pope's territories through these tumultuous times, these couple hundred years, really starts to shrink. And it really gets to be a pretty small territory even inside Italy itself, right? Called the Papal States. Now, even those get taken away. And in 1870, right, in 1870, so about 150 years ago, the Vatican is actually conquered by Italian forces. Now, it wasn't that, the story has it that there hardly was any fight at all, because the Vatican doesn't actually have that much of an army. There were some people who came forward to help defend the Pope. But essentially, the Italian army walked in and told the Pope, we're taking over. We're done with you ruling this area. Now, what happens is about 50 years later, in 1929, the Pope is granted the Vatican city-state. And so Italy comes back about 50 years later and says, look, our bad. We do want to give you a little bit of territory to rule and govern as the leader of the Catholic Church. We're going to give you Vatican city-state back. Whatever you do there, you're in charge as the Pope. And so that's been the case ever since then. So about 100 years, about 90 years actually. So for about the last 90 years, the Pope has been his only area that he has to worry about in terms of being in charge of as the actual ruler, the mayor, the king, is that little piece of property that's the Vatican city-state, which is, probably just a couple square miles. And mostly it's St. Peter's Basilica there in Rome. If you went on World Youth Day, it's, you can walk across it, and you can walk across Vatican city-state in 20 minutes, okay? So that's really been the only place where the Pope is the king now. And so we're going to talk a little bit about all of the implications of this in the next class, about infallibility, the Pope now not having all this area and land to rule over and worry about. We're going to continue to talk about what the Church does in response to the Industrial Revolution here as well. But let's go ahead and end this chapter with some questions. The question, what does the word infallible mean? What does the word infallible mean? Number two, if someone said Catholics think the Pope can never sin because Catholics believe that the Pope is infallible, how would you respond to that? Number three, is everything a Pope says infallible? Number four, what is liberalism in the way that the Church defines liberalism? And number five, by 1929, what land was the Pope in charge of? Okay, what was the land that the Pope was in charge of in 1929? Okay, those are all of our questions for this chapter. I hope and pray that you're having a great week, and know of my prayers for you. If I can ever do anything, please let me know. And God bless and have a fantastic week.